We have a housing shortage in this nation. It just impacts everything.
Government is acting in the best interests of the government.
What is the solution here? What do we need to start doing to increase our productivity levels?
The incentive is then for them to fight, claw, scrape, do everything they can to keep those jobs. If inflation's 5% and I get a 5% pay rise, I'm not getting any more money. But if I go up a tax bracket, I'm paying a higher rate of tax on the same amount of money. We're living as a nation well beyond our means.
Yeah.
So on the taxpayer coin, I mean, that's to me is criminal. Think about the GST. If your biscuits before GST cost $1, now they cost $1.10. The government's now getting 11 cents rather than 10 cents.
Why a recession is so bad.
Unless some of these things are addressed, Australia economically is cruising for a bruising.
You're watching the JJ Podcast.
Well, Dimitri Burshtein, economist, policy analyst and commentator, thank you so much for joining us today. There's a lot to unpack with the current state of the Australian economy, so we do appreciate your time. Let's just get straight into it. And off the top, I would love for you just to describe how you think the Australian economy is right now.
Well, Jamie, thank you for having me on your podcast, your illustrious podcast. I describe the Australian economy as a boiling frog. We're economically traveling to a world of hurt, but it's happening slowly and incrementally, and people aren't necessarily, because people don't feel things until they're in big lumps. But I think the economy's getting worse and worse, and it's manifesting more broadly than just economically. I actually think that a lot of our social issues are a manifestation of people feeling poor, but they can't actually put their finger on what the cause of it is. Our income, I think our disposable income in Australia has been declining for 10 years. It's like the worst in the OECD. Possibly as early as tomorrow, Friday, the 13th of February, Australia's gross national Commonwealth debt will crack $1 trillion. It's sitting at the moment at $933 billion. It's going to crack $1 trillion. We have deficits as far as the eye can see. GDP, whilst growing really slowly, given that immigration population's going up, we've been in a per capita recession consistently for approximately 3 years. I don't think the economy's going well, and I don't think we're pointing in the right direction.
Just before we move on, talking about the debt, how it's about to tip over to that $1 trillion, and it's looking like it's going to be about $1.1 trillion by the next financial year. What exactly are the implications of that for Australians? And I'm thinking, the high interest payments that we're going to be paying daily. The next generations are going to be paying this off for decades and decades and decades to come.
Future.
Well, we're basically, debt is essentially bringing your future consumption forward. So we're taking the food off the table of our children, our grandchildren.
Borrowing from the future to pay for today.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's one thing to borrow to invest in infrastructure or income-generating assets or productivity-generating assets, but we're borrowing to consume. And that's just unsustainable.
Yeah.
And so what does it mean? Well, debt is the fastest growing item in the budget. People are talking about the out-of-control NDIS at 8 to 10%. Well, debt is growing faster than that. Interest rates globally, which kind of bottom because of COVID and a lot of the stimulus from central banks, they're on a trajectory up. They may not get us like 1990s Keating, Volcker levels of 17, 18%, but they're going up. At the moment, a 10-year Australian government bond, the yield or what the government has to pay on that is around 5%. So not all of it, but a lot of the government debt is older, so it's not necessarily at 5%. Some of it's much lower, so the average yield is much lower. But over time, it'll converge to 5%, and let's just do the maths. 5% of $1 trillion has $50 billion a year. Right, that's what the NDIS costs. And it's just, and the risk is that if this is not caught under control, you can wind up into a debt spiral because you cannot grow an economy by raising taxes. It's just, so if the debt continues to grow faster than the economy, at some point you won't be able to catch up and you'll default, as have, several African countries, as have several South American countries, as almost the UK did in the 1970s before Margaret Thatcher came along. And they had to get Australia, it would be almost comic if we had to go to the IMF and look for an emergency loan bailout because of the private markets. Now, I think there are certain advantages Australia has over those economies. For example, our superannuation system. We have, at the moment, I think, around $4 trillion. But the first thing that will happen is the government will nationalise superannuation. And it's not like it hasn't happened before. In the early 2000s, Argentina couldn't borrow money on the global capital markets, so they confiscated the private superannuation's savings of its citizens and gave them a government pension back. So it's not unprecedented, but, this is the risk with debt. And we're only the $1 trillion we're only talking about is the Commonwealth government. If you aggregate the states and the territories, there's probably another $600 billion on that. And the Australian households are, if not the most indebted, are the second or third, in the top three most indebted households per capita in the world. So
it's an incredible statistic.
We're living as a nation well beyond our means.
Yeah.
So unless some of these things are addressed, Australia economically is cruising for a bruising.
I want to ask you about what you think your biggest misconception is that Australians have the economy, think about the economy. When I say that, you just mentioned you cannot tax a nation to success or to wealth. And that was a quote from last year that Ted O'Brien said a lot that I really liked. Because when it comes to an economy, a country, managing budgets, managing productivity, you need to provide incentives for investment and for employment. But the problem is, when I say misconception, the problem we have now is that, I know this isn't a left versus right game, but the Labor government have been very, very good, and their followers, their voters, at telling people that if we incentivise the boss, if we incentivise the business owner, we're letting the rich guy get rich. And that's a terrible misconception, I believe, that has created the dangers in our economy now. So do you agree? What do you think is the biggest misconception that the everyday Australian has?
I think it's a cultural factor. I think that the government is a benevolent actor. It's acting in the best interests of the people. Government is acting in the best interests of the government. Okay?
Powerful.
There was a famous economist, forgive me, I think his name was Buchanan. He won a Nobel Prize for what's called public choice theory. And he said that, and it basically said that public servants, politicians, their first priority is self-interest, like for everyone else. Why are they somehow different to the rest of us? So, the first thing governments do is they pay themselves well, and then they get nice offices. And if there's any money left over, they'll do the private services. So I think there's an over-reliance on government and a misconception of what government can do. Government essentially has two broad levers. It has legislating and redistributing, tax and spend. Government doesn't create wealth. It takes it, moves it around. Now, what's happened is now the philosophy of the Keating government, it's not the Keating government, the Hawke and Keating period was you grow the pie. And, yes, the wealthy may get wealthier, but it lifts all boats.
Yes. The standards for society all come up with it. Correct.
But because the economy is not really growing, in fact, it's getting, smaller per capita, for a poor person to feel wealthier, somebody has to take from somebody else. So this is why I said earlier, I think it's causing all these frictions at the moment in that there's, if I hear that, fair share of tax nonsense again, can somebody please explain to me what is a fair share of tax?
Yeah.
For parties of the left and the green, a fair share of tax is somebody else paying more so I can maintain my lifestyle.
Yeah.
I think that this is where a lot of the Europeans are at the moment. We've gone into a period of redistribution, and that has economic and social consequences. And I think we're not as bad as some other countries, but I think we're getting there.
What does worry me significantly at the moment with our economy, I'm obviously not an economist by any means, Dimitri, but when I look at the job creation, and 8 out of 10 new jobs are coming from that government sector. So whether it's directly funded by the government or indirectly, but they're still receiving money in some capacity. And you look now, there was an article in the Australian and the AFR late last year where 50% of the voting population are now receiving majority of their income from the government. And you start to then see even wealthy people are also getting handouts. And so the economy, everyone's starting to become on like that even level where everyone starts to rely on the government, no matter where you are in the spectrum of wealth. How do we remove that? Because when you start having a society that are all relying on government handouts, it's going to be incredibly hard to remove that. It's going to be entrenched into our society that everyone just wants to put their hand out.
And then how do you reverse it?
How do we move on from that and start focusing back into the private sector and get away from that reliance on government?
Well, to your comment about the 80% of new jobs, there's a belief. I can't say it's in the government, across the Albanese government, but it's certainly in the Chalmers office, because he did say, and he said it, if without government spending, we would have been in a recession. I mean, that just tells you that they think that's what the role of the government is. Now, if I can just tell you a little anecdote, one of my favorite anecdotes from a Nobel Prize winning economist, Milton Friedman. I don't know if you heard of him. He was the thesis supervisor of Thomas Sowell, one of my economic heroes. Friedman was in China, and he was being shown around, and he was taken to a work site where some workers were digging up, labouring to work a road. And he asked his guide, he says, why are they working with shovels rather than with, equipment to make it, faster and more efficient? And his guide said to create jobs. And to which Friedman says, well, why don't you just give them teaspoons? It's that kind of logic. Can we just, the Australian economy is a low 4% in unemployment. Can we just imagine what really level of employment we'd be at if it wasn't for the government works programs? Now, what you're describing is about everyone on the teat, which has electoral consequences, and even it's middle class. It's called middle class welfare.
Yeah,
and it's something that the Hawke-Keating government worked really, really hard to get rid of. So they implemented means testing for pensions and welfare. It used to be universal. And then came along middle-class welfare John Howard, who brought back a lot of middle-class welfare, the baby bonus, what's it called, healthcare rebates. Yeah. There was a lot of middle-class welfare that was reintroduced by the Howard government. And, once that, cat was out of the bag, we have essentially, that 50%, that analysis was prepared by an acquaintance friend of mine, Robert Carling from the Centre for Independent Studies, but that also includes people employed by the government. But if, to me, I can't understand the thinking of this, that a family on a combined income of around $550,000 can get access to childcare rebates. Yeah. And there's no work test for it. So, you can go and have an afternoon match of tennis and drop your kid off. Yeah. On the taxpayer coin. That's, to me, is criminal. Yes. The NDIS is not means tested. The healthcare rebate has some means testing in it now, but this is it's almost like the government as a drug dealer. you make everyone addicted.
Exactly.
And, politically, if somebody stands up and says, we're going to take that off you.
Yeah, you're going to lose their vote.
Correct.
And so we're going to end up in this really vicious cycle because it's not sustainable. As we've just spoken about, we're heading towards $1 trillion worth of debt.
I want to ask, bear with me, because I'm going to ask a question that's probably going to sound very stupid.
No such thing.
I want to know why a recession is so bad. When I say that, right now, government spending is keeping us out of a recession. And it's been that way for quite a while. But really, if you broke it down per capita, as you say, that economic pie might be getting bigger, but everyone's slice of that pie is getting significantly smaller. And that's why no one feels like they're getting ahead. But if governments are doing that effectively to keep us out of a recession, why is a recession so bad? Is it just because it looks bad for the government? Or is it actually, are we going to be any worse off?
It's actually a political problem because we've set up this expectations that you can't have a recession. But again, and I hate to quote economic writers, and I tend to quote the older ones, Friedrich Hayek, a famous Nobel Prize winning economist, spoke of malinvestment. So when economies overheat or, growing too fast, people invest in things that aren't necessarily sustainable. And the purpose of a recession is it's a cleansing mechanism. It clears away a lot of that, he calls it malinvestment, and allows capital and labor and land and other things to go to higher, value activities. And so, whilst, and I know why it's a good political line that, one of your former guests, Tim Wilson, spoke about all these business failures. I actually don't think that's a bad thing in it. Businesses need to fail. It's creative destruction. I mean, I use this example a lot. Ever since MasterChef started, everyone loves the romance of running setting up a restaurant. But a restaurant is a really, really hard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And harder to make profit.
Correct. And so a lot of people open up cafes and restaurants without understanding, and they go broke. And so rather than trapping that labor and capital by providing subsidies all the time, it allows that capital and labor to go somewhere else and be productive. And so I don't think a recession, it depends on the depth of the recession, of course, but recessions aren't in and of themselves a bad thing. They're a cleansing mechanism. They wash out the malinvestment. And even though, it cost them politically, was it 91, 92 when Paul Keating said, this is a recession we had to have.
Yeah.
He was right because it cleared out all of that bad investment. And that's not the only reason. It was part of a number of reasons why economic growth started, because there's all this trapped capital and trapped labor that could go and, so people who were stuck in these, factories, highly regulated factories that were producing stuff that people didn't want to buy, they could go and start their own business. They became contractors. They did, they went to school, whatever. It allowed the economy to heal, because economies and businesses aren't perpetual. Very few businesses are perpetual. They die, they're born, they grow, they die, it's the creative destruction process.
Dimitri, something that is constantly making headlines is all around inflation and the words stubbornly high. Explain to our listeners about the implication of, we've just been speaking about government spending, but inflation that is high, and as a result, the RBA having to lift the cash rate up to 3.85. And I know that the governor has, well, I was going to say finally come out and said, but did come out recently in the Senate estimates about, yes, it was contributed to government spending, of which she had previously not said that was the reason. Just talk through exactly what inflation is for those that don't know, but we hear the word all the time, and the impacts that it is having in our economy and why we need to be bringing this down.
Okay. Technically, inflation means increase in the supply of money. What it translates to in everyday households is an increase in the average price level. So people aren't necessarily earning more, but things are costing more. So their purchasing power is reduced. Why is inflation bad? It is because, it is because particularly for the poor people, they're, often on a pension or on a fixed income. Their income's not growing, but their costs are going up.
Yeah.
Wealthier people don't do as bad because inflation washes through assets first. So you get asset price inflation, shares, property, and whatnot. The biggest winner of inflation is government. Another word for inflation is tax. I mean, as Ronald Reagan once said, inflation is not a sign of the people living too well, it's a sign of the government living too well. So inflation generates more taxation revenue for the government without the government having to pass a law or stand up in Parliament or explain themselves. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Think about the GST. If your biscuits before GST cost $1, now they cost $1.10, the government's now getting 11 cents rather than 10 cents. Think about how it washes through GST. Think about how it washes through, house prices. So house prices can go up because of inflation. So, capital gains tax, land tax, all go up without any passage of legislation. Fringe benefits tax, pay, how does it manifest in salaries? Well, I'll give you an example because I wrote about it the other day. In one of his big, he described it as a good thing, the change to the stage 3 tax cuts, to finance what they wanted to do, they reinserted what's called a 37-cent tax bracket. So, there are tax brackets and people can move up in income because their salaries are, for example, indexed.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily, if inflation's 5% and I get a 5% pay rise, I'm not getting any more money. But if I go up a tax bracket, I'm paying a higher rate of tax on the same amount of money.
Yeah.
So that means that the government's getting more tax out of me. So I'm worse off for getting my inflation adjustment in my salary. So governments make it up in GST, capital gains tax, payroll tax, income tax. So it's a way for governments to generate more money without having to pass a law.
If governments benefit from inflation being high, why on earth would they want to bring it down? Like, we need it to be brought down, right?
Politics, because the people don't want it.
So it's this game of they benefit from having more money,
Well,
they
they
need to be voted in again.
But they would never say that. But, you still need an election and, people are unhappy about going backwards as we have been going backwards.
Oh, yeah.
Of course they're going to say we're going to, but have they done anything? The current government thinks that giving electricity rebates reduces inflation. It doesn't reduce inflation. It just moves it around. So it just pushes it from one period to the next. So, and it's actually worse because they're actually pushing it on to the next generation by putting it on the credit card.
Productivity, 18-year low in this country. How do you see us fixing this problem? Because I know we had the economic roundtable, which was originally meant to be the productivity roundtable, that was then changed to
Which
that.
achieved nothing.
I don't think I've seen anything,
No.
come out of that. You might be able to correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure I haven't seen anything come out of that economic roundtable.
Politicians demonstrated why we have a productivity issue.
Yeah.
It wasn't productive.
So what is the solution here? Like, what do we need to start doing to increase our productivity levels?
What came out of as I refer to as Jim's Jamboree, a lot of press releases, a lot of photos, announcements about nuisance tariffs that would have been addressed. It's very simple. Government has to get out of the way.
Yeah.
Productivity at its simplest is the ratio of outputs to inputs. That may sound technical, but what it means is it's, for example, the amount of labor, capital, and land I put in and what comes out at the end.
Yeah.
Regulation is a big barrier to that because if half my workforce is compliance, which is essentially a byproduct of regulation, they're not producing anything. So if I have to increase my compliance workforce to deal with government regulations, that's not adding to productivity. If my employees can't work to their full capacity because of all this regulation, that's affecting my ability to deliver outputs. My inputs are the same, but my outputs are reduced or slowed. Same thing with tax. It's just taking, resources. They're taking resources out of the system. So the most simplest way to address productivity is to reduce taxes, reduce regulation, and reduce barriers to investment. So, it's the story I told earlier about, the shovels, teaspoons, and, earth movers. Don't make it expensive to buy earth movers. Don't make it complicated. So, there's a lot of discussion about why business is not investing, because, machinery runs on electricity. Electricity is expensive and going up and unpredictable. So, if I own a small business, I have a coffee machine, I'm getting lots of people through. Should I buy a second coffee machine? Well, they use a lot of electricity, those coffee machines. What's going to happen to the price of, electricity? Is it worth me taking a risk? Because I don't know how much coffee I'm going to sell, but I have to take a risk to buy that second coffee machine. Add to that, some of the industrial relations laws that, affect how I can pay people and the hours they can work. And, if I buy a second machine and I have to, am I going to pass the threshold, the threshold, the turnover threshold on unfair dismissal? It's just really, really complicated to start a business. The number of licenses and regulations you have to deal with to set up and run a business, it's really hard. And, I think I would love Australia to be a country of enterprise, but at the current time, you'd really have to have your head examined if you want to start up a business. You can get paid more, get better conditions working for government.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a shocker. We just touched on Jim Chalmers' economic roundtable meeting. At the same time, I think, Jamie, we discussed this last year when it happened. Joe Hildebrand held his own roundtable with 8 people that were in different sectors of the economy, different industries. One of them was a builder, man in his 50s that had a son who I'm assuming is kind of apprentice age or early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And they had discussed the fact that the father, when he had been a builder, they used to build a house in 8, or I think he said even 9 to 12 months back then. And now it's anywhere between 18 months and 3 years to build a house. So you talk about red tape, certifications, IR laws, taxes, different things that are involved. We have a housing shortage in this nation, so it just impacts everything.
Well, a lot of regulation is about, not always, it's about de-risking systems. It's about taking risk out of the system. So there's often a well-intentioned, but, there's there's a risk and a reward. Now, when you're in government, you're not required to balance those things off. Your job is to de-risk everything. And, as I mentioned, public choice theory, if you have a team of public servants, they're tasked with, improving the regulation of, business, of buildings. Once they've done that, they're not going to say, right, let's go find another job. They're going to say, all right, we need the next draft, and then the next draft, and the next draft. So it just incrementally builds on itself. There was a famous, I think he would be described as a political scientist, Stephen Tellis from, I think it was Princeton University. He referred to the system called a kludgeocracy. A kludge is a term in software development. It's like a patch. You have a quick problem, you slap a patch on it, and and you don't take a step back and you don't have a systemic look. You just patch and patch and patch and patch. And eventually, you guys may not be old enough. You get Microsoft Windows and you get the blue screen of death.
So now it's the spinning wall of death. Something's loading.
It's the system eventually collapses, and this is where we're at that point. Well, not necessarily at that point. We're approaching the point where you just can't do anything. The approvals. There was this big brouhaha recently about the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act reforms. I'd like to remind you and your viewers who actually passed that legislation. That was John Howard, 2001. Thank you Thank you, John. So, yes, everything's a compromise, but these are some of the legacy problems that we're dealing with. So we need, and of course, the bureaucrats will want to de-risk the system because that's what they're not paid to take risks. This is why we need wise and hardworking politicians. And unfortunately, I worry we've just, the last generation, both sides, all sides, just, they're not there. The incentives are wrong.
You've literally just led me into what I wanted to ask you next, was that, Labor have such an enormous majority in Parliament right now. They should use this time to be bold, to be creative, to bring in economic reform. What's something that you think that they could do now that is bold, whether it is something like addressing, I don't know if bracket creep is considered bold, but something that put money that where it's going to create jobs and innovation within this country that we can actually start to turn things around?
Look, the solutions, everything's connected, so it's really hard. But some of the more easier things, I would just, take a sledgehammer to middle class welfare. NDIS, means tested, co-payments. Same with, they're going to hate, I don't know why it is an article of faith that everyone can go to a doctor and get bulk billed. Why does Mike Cannon-Brookes, who's a billionaire, why should he be able to go and get bulk billed with, and queue up with a pensioner? I don't understand why it's an article of faith that Medicare can't be means tested. Why can't people be, charged co-payments? We need to address middle class welfare. That's, the bureaucracy in Canberra is completely out of control. Let's just remember there's, I think, around 250,000 Commonwealth public servants.
Are we one of the most in terms of bureaucrats, I think we're one of the most governed countries in the world per capita. When you look at our local, state and federal parliament, government, politicians, crazy stuff. And I will
agree with you there, and I will point out that this is after a lot of the services that other nations provide have been privatized. So, for example, Telstra was privatized. A lot of those countries still have government-owned telephones, airports, and there's a lot of services that have been privatized in Australia, and yet still we have the highest proportion.
Unbelievable.
Let's just remember, the Commonwealth does not provide services. Education's run by the states. Healthcare is run by, the Commonwealth moves money around, but it's also the states and territories that run the hospitals, run the schools. 240,000 people, there is that doesn't count the military, but, and yes, there's the federal police and border force. Yeah, there are some service provision, but most of it is just, advice and shuffling money around. I looked it up the other day. The Secretary General, I think the title is, or Director General of the New South Wales Department of Education. The New South Wales Department of Education is the largest employer in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay? We're talking about a couple of million kids. We're talking about, I don't know, if not a couple of 100,000 teachers, thousands of schools. His salary would be around, $600,000, $700,000 a year. The Commonwealth head of the Department of Education, which runs not one school, not one, university, it has an operating budget of, several $100 million, and he earns $1 million a year. I just don't understand why we do this, particularly since, if I go back to first principles, Section 51 of the Australian Constitution says, does not list education as something that the Commonwealth is involved in. Why do we even have a Commonwealth Department of Education? Why do we have a Department of Commonwealth Health? Commonwealth Department of Health, yes, there are cross-border health and, but, we're talking about, billion-dollar behemoths. We don't need a Commonwealth Department to supervise
something that other people are already doing.
States and territory. So if you look at the governance of the medical system, you've got the Commonwealth Department of Health, and then you've got the the State Department of Health, and you've got regional area health service, and then you've got the hospital, and then you've got the doctor fiefdoms within. I mean, how many layers of oversight do we need to run a health system?
Dimitri, we recently met with Mr. Howard where we talked about GST and the introduction of it, and more so just around that after 25 years, it's never shifted off 10%, which appears to be low in today's standards. What are your thoughts around GST?
Look, I think a GST is a good tax because what you're looking for in a tax is simplicity. It's easy to collect. It's easy to calculate.
It's consumption. If the rich are spending more, they're
Correct.
paying more, and if the poor are spending less, they're paying less.
And as I said to you earlier, there's a difference between tax and transfer. If you want to compensate the poorer people, you can do that, but don't add complexity to the system. The problem with the Australian GST design goes back, it's the original sin. If I can just rewind a couple of years, well, actually, I'll go further. The Australian Constitution, the Australian Federation was designed that the states were the big taxes, they had income tax, and the Commonwealth would finance itself with excises. Somehow that, what happened was World War I or World War II, the states agreed to give income tax powers to the Commonwealth to simplify financing for the war, on the presumption they'd get it back. After the war, the Commonwealth refused to give it back, and there was a very bad High Court decision that supported that. So there was this kind of like kludge, if I may say, that the Commonwealth got all the income tax, and the states kind of like bodged it and got the excise taxes. So petrol, tobacco, alcohol. And the whole system kind of worked, and the states, because of competition between states, the tax rate on tobacco and alcohol was kept in check because, New South Wales couldn't increase it too much because Queensland will keep it down. And so you couldn't have this situation with tobacco tax back then because there would be competition with the states. For example, Australia used to have death duties. And how did we get rid of death duty? It was a state-based tax. What happened? He was Premier of Queensland, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, said, we're abolishing death taxes. So what everyone from Victoria...
other states followed.
No, everyone from Victoria and New South Wales got up and left and moved to Queensland.
Yeah.
So eventually they had to follow. We used to have stamp duty on share trading. So, I don't know, when you used to trade shares, you would basically, get a, state-based tax. It made it difficult to collate. It was, it was just an abomination. 1997, 98, 99, it was again, Queensland government, the Wayne Goss government decided to abolish it. Who was Wayne Goss's chief of staff at the time? Kevin Rudd. They abolished stamp duty on share trading of marketable securities. What happened? All the other states followed. So we used to have a federation is about the states competing against each other. Okay. Come 1997, there was a case where somebody in New South Wales, was dealing, I think, with chop or illegal tobacco. The New South Wales Tax Office was pursuing him, and this fellow, whose name escapes me, decided to take the matter to the High Court because his argument was that New South Wales government had no authority to charge excise. Lo and behold, the High Court found that states couldn't charge it, so overnight, tobacco and alcohol taxes went up, sucked up to Canberra, and so standardised. All the states were the same. There's no more competition, so...
Now we have one of the highest beer excises in the world.
Okay. Follow that up, 1999. Was it 1999 or 2000 when the GST came on? So the GST replaced a lot of state-based taxes and sucked it up to Canberra. So today... last I looked, there was around 82% of all taxes collected in Australia collected by the Commonwealth. So there's no tax competition between the states. Okay? So there's no pressure to hold or maintain taxes. It's all by, and Commonwealth indexes petrol tax and tobacco tax and alcohol tax. Couldn't have been done before. So, to my mind, the biggest issue with the GST was the design. So the GST was meant to be that all the GST collected would go to the states. What they should have done was go back to the original first principles and say, right, the Commonwealth will get the GST, and the states, you get your income tax powers back. And yes, there'll be people who said, you'll have states don't know how to charge income taxes. That's not true. Payroll tax is an income tax of a sort. It's just not, it's basically a flat tax over, like if you have a payroll over X amount, it's a flat amount. It's an income tax. It's just called the payroll tax. So then you could have competition between the states on income taxes. But now we have the Commonwealth who collects most of the taxes, and power comes with money. So the Commonwealth says, we'd like your hospitals to run this way. Everyone the same. And if you don't, we won't give you any money. We'd like your schools to have this national curriculum. And if you don't want it, you don't want to agree with us, we just won't give you any money. So we've lost this competition between the states. So it used to be that Victoria, back in the 90s, had the best health system in the world. It was the most efficient, best-run health system. Now it's all standardized. New South Wales used to have the best educational curriculum in Australia. So when they kind of standardize it, they can't set the bar at the top. They set the bar right at the bottom because you can't do it. So that's the problem with the GST. So if you raise the GST, and if, of course the Commonwealth can change like this business about, you need all the states to agree. That's nonsense, because the Commonwealth can just pass a law that says we don't need the states to agree. Any increase in the GST, what happens to it? Does it go to the states? Does the Commonwealth keep it? And then there's the other worst thing about it is then, because the Commonwealth gets all the money and they promise to give it all out, they don't give it out on a per capita basis. They don't, because they know where the tax is collected. They don't give it on an actual basis. They don't even give it on a per capita basis. They have the Commonwealth Grants Commission sit around like, wise kings working out, who deserves it more on this principle of horizontal fiscal equalisation, where the theory is that, if, the hospital quality and the school quality across Australia should be equal. That's nice, again, in theory, but what it does is it incentivizes bad behavior. Why should, Northern Territory gets around $6 of GST for every dollar collected. Tasmania gets around, I think it's $1.50 or something like that. So the wealthy states are subsidizing the poor states. So where is the incentive for the poor states to innovate? Do better. Yeah. I'm still waiting for somebody to explain to me why I, as a New South Wales person who has no interest in AFL, has to contribute to an AFL stadium in Tasmania that, once in a blue moon will ever be filled. And this is the problem. The GST did not destroy the Federation, but it certainly didn't help it. And many of our economic problems go back to the Federation not working properly. I'm old enough to remember that one of the initiatives that, as Prime Minister Tony Abbott implemented, was a review of the Federation and Commonwealth state relations. I also remember that one of the first decisions of Malcolm Turnbull was to terminate that. So there is always a fight from the centre to, the wings. Now, I believe that decisions should be made as close as possible to where their impact is. And we have, Canberra, the citadel on the hill, the highest rising property prices in Australia, telling people what's good for them. Now, whether the issues in, far north Queensland are the same as in southwest Sydney, are the same as, West Perth, that's not relevant. They have one colour and it's black. There's one solution, that's it. Because that's, and you want the money, that's the way you get it.
Unbelievable when you put it like that.
Yeah. Before we let you go, I just wanted to really quickly get your thoughts on something that has been making headlines recently, and that is the superannuation tax changes, potentially. This is just being floated. It hasn't actually passed Parliament at the time of our discussion. And over $3 million superannuation accounts, the tax is going to go from 15% up to 30%. And for accounts that are over $10 million, will go up to tax by 40%. And reading in between it all, it looks as though dying is also going to be quite expensive. Please elaborate.
Totally not funny, but also absurd.
Yes.
Let's go back in time. I think it was in the mid-90s, after the Howard government won election, which was in 96, they undertook a number of reforms, and one of them was the Charter of Budget Honesty, which was a good idea at the time. One of the things that came out of it was, the name has changed, but it's essentially what they call the Tax Expenditures Report. Mm-hmm. And it's a report that big government people love to bring out. They produce it, the Treasury puts it out around January of every year, and it says how much tax is lost to the government because of these discounts. So, for example, superannuation not being taxed the full marginal tax rate, dividend imputation, there's a shopping list of it. And it usually comes up to some, ridiculous number. The intention of it was honourable, so you can say, we're not getting, but, what it has become as is a roadmap for tax increases. And so they, the way this thing is calculated, they assume that everything should be taxed at the top marginal tax rate. And so because superannuation is not just taxed at the top marginal tax rate, the government is losing tax revenue. So we should do something about that. Well, you can deal with it two ways. The first way is you can raise the tax on superannuation on your house. The other way is you can cut income taxes. No, they don't want to cut income taxes, so they're going to go after. So Treasury has been dropping these breadcrumbs for years, and so they drop the. You can. I've written about this in a number of publications. The timing was impeccable. So normally they would put it out it was delayed, and they put out the tax expenditure statement in the morning, and in the afternoon they announced the original batch of superannuation tax changes. Same day. And that was that superannuation accounts with more than $3 million would be charged at, everything above $3 million would be charged at 30%. As is often the case with Treasury officials who are on defined benefit schemes, they don't think about people with defined normal superannuation accounts. They designed a system that is, theoretically elegant, but practically ludicrous. So it would have resulted in the taxation of unrealized income tax, unrealized capital gains. And it was, to set the bar and wait for the benefits to accrue, they didn't want to index the $3 million. There was obviously a lot of issues and a lot of complaints. So eventually the government capitulated and they decided to change that. Please forgive me, I don't know the details per se. I believe the legislation was tabled in Parliament last week, but it essentially says that earnings over accounts over $3 million will be charged at 40%,
30%, and then 40% past 10 million.
Yes. It will only be calculated on realised capital gains.
Which is a positive, because it was quite controversial when they were considering doing it unrealised.
Correct, because it's
taxing you on money you hadn't made yet.
Yeah.
Well,
criminal.
It's very complicated because again, when you're on these, either on an industry super fund or you don't think about these things. But a lot of people have, for example, property in their.
Yeah.
How do you value a property? They have art. How do you value art? What about a farm? How do you, and there's volatility. So one year the price may go up, so you'll pay a tax, and next year the value goes down, but they weren't going to give you a refund.
They won't give it back.
They won't give it back.
Exactly.
So the thing about the making death complicated is that the accounting period for superannuation is, the financial year, July to June. The problem is, what happens if you die in the middle of the year? You're an executor of an estate. You want to settle these things quickly, distribute it, and close the estate.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily, because you don't know what the estate's tax liability is until the end of the period. So it just adds, complexity. One of the wonderful things about the superannuation system is that it's a flat tax. Before this change, it will be a flat tax, which means it is really simple. You don't need an army of accountants to find you,
Yes.
So this is the political problem we have with our income tax system. We have these brackets and we have ridiculous levels of, tax deductions, which incentivizes, Harvey Norman and JB Hi-Fi to do ads in June of every year. Buy a new computer so you can get the tax deduction. Or, whether you need a computer or not is not relevant, but, get your tax deduction.
Yeah.
And so we have all these tax deductions. We have these, special rules here and there. We have a ridiculously complex income tax system. And this is part of the problem. A couple of years ago in the United States, they proposed to do a much more simplified tax system where they would send out, a pre-populated tax return, which for 90 to 95% of people, their income is only, let's call it a bit of interest and their salary income. So, they'll pre-populate your tax return, submit it if you have some variations, but for most people it'd be fine. Do you know who the biggest opponents of that were? The tax accountants. So the biggest winners of the tax complexity system we have are the lawyers, the accountants, the advisors. They're the ones that don't want it. So we can simplify our tax system a great degree, but they have this optical nonsense of you have to have a progressive tax system. There's a difference between the tax and the transfer system. Australia has a very sophisticated and targeted tax transfer system, so we can that will be a huge productivity boon. Let's just have a flat tax, and for people who are at the poor end of the spectrum, they can get a supplement every that's what the transfer system is for. A lot of people work and still get, part unemployment benefit, part pension.
Yeah.
The system works. Why aren't we using it? Why do we have to have this complexity? Because there are, vested interests. So
I know that we're out of time.
Yes.
I just literally have one. This can be yes or no. You've mentioned so much how simple the system can be, and you've mentioned Treasury and the crumbs they drop and all the rest of it. It blows my mind that I could become an MP in my local seat tomorrow. People could vote for me. I go to Parliament, my team have a majority, and I could get appointed in the cabinet, front bench. I could become the treasurer. And I've never had to run a business, manage a budget. Do you think the system needs to change? How dangerous do you think it is that right now we have a treasurer, it doesn't have to be Jim Chalmers, it could be anyone, have a treasurer running an economy with 27 million people and have no experience in this area?
that's a really complicated question, and I'm not going to answer it directly. Not because I don't want to, it's because it's really hard to.
Okay.
I have a theory of politics. Well, first of all, it comes down to incentives. The incentives are wrong. This is my theory of politics. Perhaps 75 to 80% of the people we send to Canberra, this is a job that they would never in a million years in their lifetime get a better job. They're paid more. They get, Qantas Chairman's Lounge. They get a staff who tell them every day how handsome, how attractive, how smart they are. They get people inviting them everywhere. So the incentive is then for them to fight, claw, scrape, do everything they can to keep those jobs. And I would argue this is why we have a lot of this political toxicity out there. It's why it's nasty. Now, how do you tell between somebody who's actually worth it or not? I don't know, but it used to be, and, the remuneration system was designed that politics was not a career, it was a post-career role. You were a successful businessman or businesswoman, a union official, a teacher. This was something you did at the end of your career or
with expertise in a field.
Well, you're never going to get a treasurer or a health minister who's going to have that. What you're looking for is temperament and judgment. People who can make, good decisions. They're never going to have, because that's why we have the departments. They're there to do that granular work. They're not there, a minister is not sitting there on a spreadsheet working out the 10-year budget forecast. That's what they're there to exercise judgment. If somebody from the department tells you, increase capital gains tax, that's what they're there for, to say, no, that's rubbish, go away. Come up with something else. They're there for judgment. And the problem is we've professionalized politics. Of course, it's not unreasonable that 20-year-olds are in Parliament, but really, what the hell do they have to add to the debate? There's just too many people for whom, you know, in their wildest dreams, you know, once you add in their, you know, not just their salary, their superannuation,
all the
benefits.
The benefits.
You know, like they're on a this is the plain backbencher, $350,000 salary. In a million years, like half to, 2/3 of these people would never get a role like that.
Dimitri, let's not even get started about all those travel rorts and all of the other excessive spending and things that are around MPs. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the JJ Podcast.